during every single day of the Trump administration, I will very simply put America first.
President Trump has made America first a central principle of his second term also. And with a new national defense strategy expected soon, we turn to someone who helped write the original blueprint for the national security strategy.
All of these conversations began in Trump 1. Some continued during Biden, some not, but now are definitely sort of reignited in Trump 2.
That is Nadia Schadlow, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and former deputy national security advisor for strategy, where she was architect of the 2017 national security strategy. Nadia's experience gives us an expert view of the administration's thinking about U.S. foreign policy and how it might unfold in this next chapter. To understand President Trump's approach, the divisions within his administration, and what's changed since his first term, we asked Nadia Schadlow to weigh in. I'm Leslie Vinjamori, President and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and welcome to Deep Dish. So let's go straight into this. Maybe I could start with, going back to that work that you did in Trump's first administration. How would you say the world is, the same or different, the key national security challenges that the U.S. faces?
I think from 2017 to the present, I think the rest of the world has sort of caught up with the shifts and the changes and the redirections that I think President Trump articulated in his first term. That doesn't mean everyone's happy about it, but I think the conversation is very much along the lines of globalization has fundamentally changed. The purpose of multinational institutions needs to be relooked at. We are in the midst of trade adjustments that he's starting to drive and has started to drive first term and is now continuing to drive second term. Countries need to be on board in terms of their shared responsibilities for security. So I think all of these conversations began in Trump 1. Some continued during Biden, some not, but now are definitely sort of reignited in Trump 2.
So when you look back to the strategy paper that you were the architect of, do you think that the national security strategy soon to be released, do you expect it to be very different from that which you were directly engaged in?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the first Trump national security strategy was a White House document, and the themes articulated in it were President Trump's themes. There were themes that he developed during the campaign, and then a sense that fundamentally the world is a competitive place. Power matters. China's a strategic competitor, which was called out, and that was an important shift. So all of those themes were in the 2017 strategy. I think the nature of power will be addressed in the new strategy. I don't know when a new national security strategy is coming out.
During your time serving in the first Trump administration, I think many people took note that President Trump was really focused on, in his inaugural speech, on Panama, on Greenland, on Canada. And there have been numerous writings by academics, foreign policy thinkers, questioning whether that was indicative of perhaps a way of thinking about the world that was returning to a focus on spheres of influence. What is your thinking on that?
I think the president has made it clear from the start he is concerned about borders, open borders, about drugs coming into the country, drug cartels. A lot of it is arriving through that region of the world, and so it's natural that he should be focused on that region of the world. I don't know that he's ever spoken about spheres of influence, at least in the speeches that I've read. He hasn't addressed that, but I think it's natural for the United States to be focused on developments in regions very close to us. In addition, I think there's an awareness of China operating in these countries in ways that aren't great for American interests, and so reducing that in terms of the reshoring and the reconfiguring of trade relationships and trading patterns. I think there are a lot of positive developments that could come from the renewed attention.
Well, exactly. I mean, as you've mentioned, China's very considerable influence in the region. But it does nicely take us to the big question, which is China, something that you certainly worked on and thought a lot about in the first administration. I think during the Biden administration, it was very clear, this policy of invest, align, and compete, a policy that was increasingly tough on China. In the first few months, it felt, I think, to many of us like actually President Trump's approach to China was not as assertive, wasn't as singular, that it's taken a little bit of time to unfold. Some people argue that China's very successfully played its hand against second Trump administration, demonstrated that it has a lot of leverage by threatening to withhold the export of rare earth minerals. How do you see President Trump's articulation but also the practice, his demonstrated approach to the number one concern for most U.S. presidents recently, which is to say China? Do you see it as a continuation from President Biden? Do you see it as a very sharp break? How would you characterize?
I don't see it as a sharp break. I see similar ups and downs during the Biden administration of both administrations essentially being divided with two views that aren't completely aligned about China. So I think in both administrations, there are so-called China hawks who see China unequivocally as a serious, long-term threat to the interests of the United States and its allies and partners, meaning that it wants to displace the United States, meaning that it wants to assert its power and its form of power over much of the world. Having said that, there's another group who sees things, I think, with less concern. China's a strategic competitor. We don't want to have war with China. We're economically interdependent with China. Janet Yellen at the time, she was promoting and going to China and bringing people to China during the Biden administration. So there was this division as well in both administrations. And we're seeing the ups and downs of that now, too. It's not new that China has enormous leverage over us economically. And in terms of the rare earths problem and magnets and critical minerals, all of the inputs. And for the Biden administration, that leverage was over the entire shift toward electrification of the economy with batteries and EVs and solar panels and renewables. So I think the overall focus on these trade adjustments, on Chinese overcapacity, on having concern about our inputs and not being the subject of coercive leverage, I think those are issues that the president is sympathetic to. I don't think he wants to be at the behest or beholden of CCP decisions over the direction of the American economy. So whether or not he's thinking about China ideologically or not, I'm not sure. But I think he certainly doesn't want to be manipulated.
Now, I appreciate that last comment in particular, because I think at the end of the first Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo, I think many people saw him to be more ideological, perhaps, than even President Trump. And it is interesting to me that you began the answer to your question by talking about the divisions within the second Trump administration, because I think for a lot of us, there's been a desire to understand where the decision-making sits. I think many people believe that it really is President Trump, regardless of the fact that you've got different views on China within his administration, that it really is President Trump that calls the shots, that's driving policy. And so there's a sort of interest in how does the president understand China?
I'm not a psychologist, so I look at the trends more broadly, but I think it's also important. I pointed out there were also divisions in the Biden administration about China, about how far to press, how far to go, and, a seriousness that it's not just statements, it's also actions. So if you have to ensure that, we're less dependent on China, that we move faster in AI, that we have the energy we need for AI data centers, you also need to take a whole host of other actions like the permitting and regulatory reform and the really forceful changes in that direction that Trump is making. So again, I think the evidence is that there's plenty of people taking these problems that seriously, and the evidence is in pushing in these other areas that fundamentally have hobbled us for so long.
Let me ask you the question about America's allies during the Biden administration. Europeans were, not entirely aligned on their own China policy. The view of many has been that for the U.S. to be effective in countering the challenge that China presents, that it needs to have the support of its allies. How do you assess what's going on now when it comes to, the ability of the U.S. government to work with Europe and the ability of the Europeans to work with the United States on China? The Europeans have been struggling to navigate this period of U.S. leadership for all sorts of reasons. I am very curious your thoughts on Europe when it comes to this China question.
I don't think there's a European position, but Europe is being forced into a European position because it's the EU. So you have a view in Germany that's different in some ways than a view in Italy. And Europe remains somewhat divided on this issue, although over time, they clearly have recognized dependence on China as a problem. And Europe is being an object of China's overcapacity. I mean, the German car industry has completely changed because of China, or is at risk of completely changing. The German advanced manufacturing industry, which it had been extremely strong at, is also completely changed. One of its most important companies bought out years ago by China. The Italian, textile clothing sector completely changed by China. I mean, it was Ursula von der Leyen who called China a systemic rival several years ago. And I think that was a great way to characterize this clash of two systems. But it's really hard for Europe to get its act together. It has a regulatory climate which is suffocating to make changes in anything. You have national countries who have different sets of national interests. And as I said, some feel more concerned about China than others. Spain has a really, different view than other countries in Europe. And I'd say even in the dominant EU position. I think what we're seeing is similar sets of divisions, but at the same time, I think there's been an understanding by Europe that they're coming along to not just being reactive to Trump all the time and immediately starting out with reasons why they don't like him. I think there's a sense of they're willing to step back and say, what is President Trump really saying here? Is he saying that the global trading system is not reciprocal? Well, yes. I mean, the EU went from hysteria after April to now a sense of, okay, we're at 15% reciprocal tariffs and we can live with that. And pretty much, it's a good gauge to see how we've actually come to, I think, a better place with our European allies.
Clearly, the question of China looms large. But as you know better than anyone, Europe sees itself as facing a very serious threat in Russia, has been existentially concerned about America's commitment to European security in general, to Ukraine in particular, and has been trying to gauge where the U.S. is heading. What, in your view, are we likely to see from the U.S. going ahead? And how do you think Europe is meeting the challenge of the moment?
Well, I think I would characterize the past few years, or even Trump 1 and today, that the White House view seems to be essentially that we want the Europeans to show that you care as much about your security as we should care about your security. Right. And fundamentally, that's what this shared responsibility has been about. Increase your defense budget, actually increase your military capability, revamp and revitalize your defense industries, work with us to ensure that we have a stronger defense industrial base overall. All of these are positive developments. I think the good relationships that President Trump has with Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, is very positive. He's realized that Putin has overplayed his hand. I think he's been surprised by that, but in a way that has made him realize that, the true nature of what Russia wants to do in Europe. And I think that's made him much more sympathetic to the Ukrainian position. But we've also seen an actual increase in an effort to supply the Ukrainians through new programs now, U.S. stockpiles to get equipment to Ukraine faster. The problem with aid to Ukraine and speed has been a problem that has not just been an American problem, it's been a European problem too. And it's still going on. And it's still a weakness of both the U.S. response and the broader NATO response has been incrementalism. From day one, we've sort of given these little packets of assistance. We haven't stood back and said, really, what is the purpose overall of how do we see this war ending and how do we help the war in a way that's favorable to their terms? And I don't think our aid packages have sort of answered that question because I think there's division.
I mean, it's fascinating to hear you talk because it confirmed what I think many of us have seen, which is that President Trump has changed his position with Russia. And perhaps what you are suggesting, too, is, of course, Europe has a huge role to play in this, but that ultimately the United States and Europe have remained aligned when it comes to the major threats, not only Russia, but also China, even with these internal divisions that you've talked about.
Yeah, I think so in quite a practical way. I think Trump's energy diversification, energy dominance agenda is a good agenda for Europe too, because it reduces ongoing dependencies on Russian energy. It provides Europeans with the flexibility they need if they're willing to be more creative. It provides a jump start for thinking about if you really want to move ahead in AI. I mean, there are lots of obstacles to that in Europe, but energy diversification is a good thing. And that's something that we can be aligned on. And Trump has called out many of the sensitive issues related to migration in Europe and has been right about them and is right about the long-term threats to many European countries internally. So I think that there are plenty of areas that if European leaders can put aside some of their initial, personal dislikes that were from Trump 1, now you have a new set of European leaders in many cases, and move to a practical, roll up our sleeves, let's work on this problem together. But I think you have so many critics of Trump in Europe, especially across the European media, that they begin almost with a sense of wanting to foment these problems. They begin from the perspective of, let's continue to, have this frame that we've always had, even though there have been plenty of holes that should have been poked into it years ago. And, I'll hear things actually from European left of how if Kamala had been elected a president, we would have, given our entire arsenal to Ukraine. Like, I heard that from a well-respected journalist on the left. And really?
I was in London for almost 20 years. I was there up until July. So I was there for the first several months of this administration. And I think part of what unsettled many people, not only leaders, but people, was the sense that different people within the Trump administration were sort of not only pushing Europe on questions of spending on military defense, on questions of energy diversification, but that they were actually digging into questions that Europeans felt were kind of core to their sovereignty, to their democracy, that they were tapping into and commenting on internal debates within the UK. Elon Musk obviously, dipped his hand in quite a lot. I think the Munich Security Conference, the J.D. Vance speech really shook people to their core. So it isn't just, the national security question. It was that there was a view that there was an overstepping in the ways that might actually turn the tide domestically.
Right. But from the perspective of someone who was sympathetic to what Vice President Vance was trying to say, the question of what we are defending and what we're asking Americans defend is a totally legitimate question. European countries might not like that, but it's a legitimate question down the line. Because if the nature of our societies change so dramatically internally, it becomes a different alliance completely. It becomes a different set of core values of what we're defending as an alliance. So I understand those sensitivities, but allies and partners should be able to have difficult conversations. And if you look at it as to what we are defending and what the West will look like, our values, our institutions, the way that we treat people, all groups, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, freedom from being attacked if you're Jewish, those are legitimate questions because they go to the heart of what the NATO alliance is about if you go to the NATO Charter and the values that it supports. So I understand that these are difficult conversations, and I can see the sensitivity, but I don't think we should shy away from sensitive discussions.
So maybe just a final question on this. President Trump obviously came in wanting to see peace in the Middle East. He was very successful and I think rightly recognized for the release of the remaining hostages. It still continues to be difficult to see the way through. What is your assessment of the policy in the region now? Where do you see it going? Where do you think it should go?
I think things are now going in a better direction than they were, before President Trump got directly involved. I think it's clear it's going to be very, very hard. I was just reading in the papers about Palestinian support for Hamas, which is still pretty strong. I mean, I'm shocked, but I guess I shouldn't be. But I think the direction of working with Gulf states, working with partners in the region to achieve a better end state, to restore stability, to start to rebuild, but to ensure that Israel is not continuing to be threatened down the line. I think those are all going to be hard to achieve, but I think the Trump administration is moving in the right direction. And the people involved are very, very serious people. They're immersed in the details. They care deeply about the region, and they want a better end state, certainly better than what the past several years have shown. It's going to be hard, having said that, but I think we're moving closer to a better possibility than we were in the years since October 7th.
Nadia Schadlow, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Deep Dish on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Leslie Vinjamori. Talk to you next week. Deep Dish is a production of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow Deep Dish on Global Affairs wherever you get your podcasts. And if someone you know might find it interesting, send it their way. As a reminder, the opinions you heard belong to the people who expressed them and not to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This episode is produced by Tria Raimundo and Jessica Brzeski, with support from Marty O'Connell and Lizzie Sokolich. Thank you for listening.